happy to be able to have this hybrid event this year, providing an opportunity for both young professionals to get advice on potential career areas in person and online. So the past couple of years, it's been solely online. So it's great to be able to do this in person once again. I'd like to start the event with an acknowledgement of country. I wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land here at the Glover Cottages. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are also connecting from, and to all other Indigenous people of Australia. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. So I'd like to start off with introducing our panellists that are joining us this evening. So we have Ané Coetzee, sorry. Ané has experience working in international development and world affairs with the goal of advancing the progress against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Ané has worked in Australia, Fiji, and the US for various UN agencies. She's also the CEO and founder of Young Women in Sustainable Development. This organisation is for young women working towards an inclusive and sustainable future. To date, the organisation's campaigns have reached 47 countries. We then have Thomas Pantle. Thomas is a senior analyst for the Department of Enterprise, Investment and Trade. Upon completing his undergraduate degree in econometrics and Chinese studies, he worked in Hong Kong and Shanghai in the finance industry and for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. He previously worked as a research officer at the Australian-China Relations Institute, specialising in foreign affairs and the Australian-China trade relationship, publishing research reports and public commentary. Lastly, we have Katherine Storey. Katherine has worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade since 2013. She has served overseas in New Delhi, India, covering Indian domestic politics, human rights, and national security. Before this, she represented Australia in international climate change negotiations, including at the Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015. She currently works in DFAT's New South Wales State Office. Prior to joining DFAT, Katherine was working in the legal sector. Each panellist will speak for approximately 10 minutes and we'll then have about 25 minutes for questions from both here in the audience and online. During the talks, for those online, please feel free to post questions in the chat. They'll be read out by my fellow council member during question time. And also please note who you would like to answer the question. All right, so we'll start with Ané.
Great. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction and thank you all for coming along to our session tonight. So as Nikki mentioned, my name's Ané and I'm the CEO and founder of an organisation called Young Women in Sustainable Development. And my career really started at the United Nations, working in a couple of different areas. So in case of interest to some of the younger people here this evening who are interested in getting into the space, I would say that if you are interested in international relations, it is a really awesome way to not only see the world, but do work that really has such a tangible impact on the world. And I think that's something that has really stood out to me throughout my time working in different UN agencies. So I was lucky enough to start at the UN the day I graduated from my master's degree. It was quite sad to miss graduation, but I thought it was worth the trade-off. So I started working in New York for the United Nations at an agency that specializes in public-private partnerships, so between governments, civil society organizations, and the private sector. And I think one thing that I really learned when I was there was just the different ways that there are to make an impact in the world of international relations and affairs. I think often when we're starting out, you know, we think about the various embassies and missions to places like the United Nations, but we don't often think about all the other elements and aspects that are involved in these big international relations structures that we can get involved in with our skills. So one thing I would really encourage you all to do is to take the time to think about what it is that you are passionate about, and then to find a way that you can incorporate that into your work in international relations. Because I think if you focus on, you know, something that you really care about and you really are passionate about making an impact, whether that's, you know, climate change, poverty reduction, ending world hunger, I think you'll find that your impact is so much more than what it would have been if you find yourself working in a space that perhaps doesn't draw you to as much. So after the time in New York, I was lucky enough to go to the Pacific with the Australian Aid Program, working as a communications and logistics project officer with the UN World Food Program. So for those who haven't heard about the Australian Aid Program, who are perhaps a bit newer to the space, one of the things they do is run the Australian Volunteers for International Development Program, which sends people of all ages into various areas, mostly around the Asia Pacific, to work on tangible capacity building programs. And it is honestly one of the most amazing things that you can ever do. While we're there to provide capacity building, I think you honestly learn so much from the communities that you work with, and just the knowledge of the people and the ways that they're taking action on some really big world issues is really, really inspiring. And so I think that's something to really consider if you are entering the space as well. There's a lot of support that's provided. It is funded by DFAT, and you're really looked after while you're in the space as well. And following that, I came back to Australia, have worked with various UN agencies since then, and I'm currently with UNICEF, which has just been lovely. So as Nikki mentioned, and you might have to cut me off because once I start talking about this, I don't stop, started an organisation called Young Women in Sustainable Development. So essentially we work to take action on some of the world's biggest issues: poverty reduction, world hunger, climate change, through empowering young women to be leaders in their local communities, to start their own projects and to have a flow-on effect at a local, national and international level, which has honestly just been absolutely incredible. So since I sent those figures to Nikki, we've actually expanded and we've now reached 126 countries. In a little over 2 months, which really speaks to sort of the need that was out there in the interest of young people to take action. I mean, currently there are 1.8 billion young people around the world, which is the largest youth generation in recorded history. And, you know, by really engaging young people and providing them with opportunities and spaces to make a change, there's so much potential for impact. And I think we've really seen that in the climate kind of activism that's happened, but we're also seeing that in areas that people often don't think about. You know, people working in communities on education programs, on programs around conserving the environment, sustaining the oceans, things like that. As you know, the UN SDGs are 17 goals that cover a really big amount of things, and there's women working tirelessly in those spaces, particularly young women who are having so much impact. And that project was really just born out of my passion for inspiring other young people, and has just connected a community of us from around the world who are working towards the same goal, which has been really, really inspiring. And I think as you are considering entering the field, I would just say to absolutely just, as I mentioned, find what you're passionate about and really just go for it. When I was in New York, I remember being at the Climate Action Summit in 2019, the year that Greta Thunberg spoke to all the world leaders. And there was actually another young woman, and I always wish I could remember her name. I've looked for it, but I can't find it. And she gave this really, really powerful speech. And she said, find your voice, find your fight, and then run at it with everything you have. And that's really stuck with me. And I think in the world of international relations, you know, you are dealing with some really big issues, and those aren't things that can be fixed overnight. They're not things that can be fixed by, you know, one group of people. They require global cooperation. And I think remembering those words really has helped me at moments where I felt like you know, we've worked so hard on this. Are we making progress? We're not meeting these SDG targets quick enough. And then I remember that and I think about, you know, all of the amazing progress that has been made because people around the world have found their voices, they've found their fight and which SDG they care about, and they're trying their best. They're running at it with all they have. And so if there's one thing that you take away from this evening, I really hope it's those words and that you'll find your voice, find your fight, and find a way to run at it with everything you have in the field of international relations. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nikki, and thank you to the Australian Institute of International Affairs for inviting me here to speak tonight to all of you. I must say that when I was asked to be a panelist, I honestly didn't feel like I was in a position to lecture or impart knowledge on, well, a group of gung-ho and sophisticated soon-to-be graduates such as yourselves. But, you know, I was in your position 5 years ago and I went to events and I must have internalized some lessons from those events and perhaps also learned a few myself along the way. And so in trepidation of speaking tonight, I actually asked a couple of very close people to myself, my parents, if they had any general sage advice for me. And all they could come up with was that I ought to listen to them both more. So there's a silver lining in that though, because although that wasn't very helpful advice, it did sort of force me to sit down and think about what were the key lessons that I learned throughout my career. And so I thought I'd just spend my time talking a little bit about the key lessons that I learned at the major junctures of my career to date. So as Nikki already pointed out, I studied a Bachelor of Economics, majoring in econometrics and Chinese. And the two major achievements for me at university were to receive a New Colombo Plan scholarship and to get an internship. But I very nearly didn't get either of these things, not until very late in my degree. And I almost gave up on getting both just because of the sheer volume of rejections that I faced. And get used to it if you want a career in international affairs. But I pursued and managed to scrape through. And it would have been very easy, I suppose, to give up when you have that many rejections. And at the time, I only had like a credit average. So it was very easy to think that maybe this is not the career for me, or maybe my grades aren't high enough. But what I would say is that build your calluses very early on. Learn to be rejected and fail and just apply. I had an Excel sheet of like 70 companies that I had applied for during my time at university. Cold emailed, cold called, interviewed for. And so go to that level and face that level of rejection. And I think that it will pay dividends later on in your career, especially in international affairs. If you want to write something, you're going to be scrutinized by everybody, your bosses, by the public. So it's a good way to sort of early on to build up some resilience. And upon graduating, I moved to China to work for the Australia Trade and Investment Commission. And to do so, well, I just graduated and I knew I wanted to have a career in China. And I wasn't really interested in being a markets trader anymore. That wasn't a passion. So what I did was I just researched who were the senior trade commissioners in Beijing and Shanghai, found their email addresses and emailed them. And the senior trade commissioner to Beijing, they gave me an interview and decided that my Chinese was not good enough. And so that wasn't going to happen. But the Shanghai office, they took a chance on me. And so moved to China, lived frugally for a few months. It was an unreal experience because when you work overseas at a young age, you're given a lot of responsibility very early on. You'll have unreal opportunities. I got to attend many government-to-government meetings in cities across China. I got to help at the inaugural China International Import Expo, helping Australian companies to expand their businesses into China, and to also see the Chinese consumer, you know, be utterly engaged and fascinated by Australian products. And so that was a very fascinating experience. And, you know, even though I gave up a job to go to China, I left that place with an offer from Austrade and many connections that would later on reach out to me and say, hey, we've got something for you. Are you interested? So if you're sort of tossing up between taking the safe option here and you've got a job offer, but you'd rather go overseas, you'd rather just take a chance, and even if it's like no money, I would still recommend that you do so, because not a lot of people get that opportunity, and you never know what you'll get from it. You'll make connections that later on down the track will be invaluable to you. And so I suppose another lesson that I learned from doing this was that competition sucks. Like, why compete, with so many other people when there are many other ways to get jobs and to get the things that you want? So for my first 2 jobs, I barely competed with anybody, because I just cold called or cold emailed people or sent them a written piece of work and just waited for their reply. Now, of course, that won't always be the case. You'll have to go through interviews and compete with hundreds, if not thousands, of other applicants that are vying for the same position as you. But my advice would be, look at other ways to also get jobs that you want. Don't just assume that you can only apply for the jobs that are posted or available. Just think about what you want, think about where it is, try to understand the people that are working in that field, show genuine interest in them. When you email them, or speak to them, know who they are and what they've done, and that's going to help a lot. And anyway, after returning from China, I went and worked for the Australian China and Relations Institute. And I'm assuming many of you want to have a career in perhaps international affairs or writing about foreign affairs. And it's a fascinating career, but I would have to say that, and this is my final lesson, is to leave your ego behind if you can, because it won't do you very well, from my experience. I remember my first day at the Australia-China Relations Institute, I told my manager, wonderful manager, Ané Coetzee, to be brutally honest with me, with my writing. Whatever I write, just be brutal about it. It's the only way I can learn. And when you leave your ego at the door, you're giving your bosses the opportunity to be like radically transparent with you, when they may not have otherwise done so. And so definitely take that opportunity to learn as much as you can. The second thing that you can get from leaving your ego behind is you'll be surprised how many mentors will find their way into your life, because mentors are highly accomplished people and they're not interested in talking to someone who claims that they know everything. So don't do that. Seek their advice and yes, leave your ego behind. And I suppose the third thing and the final thing I'd like to say is that when you do so, you allow yourself to be self-reflective, and you'll need this in a career in writing or any career really. It'll allow you to identify your blind spots and your weaknesses, and it'll allow you to correct and find course to improve those things. And so in summation, I would have to say the 3 key lessons that have helped me throughout my career would be to build some resilience really early on. If you don't have to compete, then don't. There's other ways to get things. And the third one would be to leave your ego at the door. It will do you wonders, and you'll be more liked at work as well. So yes.
I particularly like the anti-capitalist sentiment of just avoid all competition. Yeah. It's beautiful. Who cares about markets? Thank you, first up to AIIA for hosting this event, and thank you all for coming. We were discussing before the feeling of imposter syndrome that one gets when one is asked to sit on a panel like this, because I think no matter where you are in your career, there's still many people doing many more interesting things than you can imagine. And so thank you for the invitation, I guess is where I'm getting at. I thought I would just give a very brief overview of my career so far, but I imagine some of you are probably interested in DFAT, and so I thought I'd give a bit of an overview of what it is we do in DFAT, and maybe bust some myths about what we don't do. For me, I started in DFAT 10 years ago. Before that, I did a law degree. I worked for a year in the law. Like my co-panelists, I did a few internships and things, including just taking myself overseas to Thailand at one stage to volunteer, thinking that I would save the world. I did not in 3 months, unfortunately. But since joining DFAT, well, no, since joining AusAid in 2013, so I, like Tom, have also been rejected by plenty of organisations and for plenty of jobs before, including from DFAT. But I applied to the AusAid grad program and joined that department in 2013. A couple of months later, it became DFAT, and when they merged the two departments and brought the aid program in under the Foreign Policy and Trade Department. So I've really covered the full gamut of roles within DFAT. I've done development in my time in AusAid. I then moved to the climate change area and did multilateral negotiations under the UNFCCC. I moved to India and worked on a bilateral relationship, one of our most important and growing relationships in the Indo-Pacific. I've spent quite a lot of time in Canberra working at various policy roles, including in a regional Indian Ocean role. And now I'm in a more of an economic trade role in our very small Sydney office, where we are talking to domestic stakeholders about how foreign policy and trade issues impact them. So that's, I guess the point of that is that a career in DFAT is pretty varied. And I'm happy to talk more about different opportunities there. I mean, things I haven't done as well, which are very well known: consular work, humanitarian work, lots of programming. So what I guess I wanted to talk about, though, the idea of what a career in DFAT is actually like day to day, because there are a lot of lofty words that I just threw at you. One of the things I think is a perception of DFAT or of a diplomat is that we're always at cocktail parties. And I wanted to say this is partly true. We do, it's part of the job, I suppose, to attend functions and to meet people from the country that you're working with or from the counterpart agencies that you're working with overseas. And cocktail parties do serve a very important function in that. They're less fun than they sound. Their work, you're there to meet people and to build your network so that you can and build the relationship so that you can pick up the phone and talk to that person the next day if you've got an issue. That said, some of them are fun, and I will forever remember doing dancing after the COP conference in 2015 with Christiana Figueres. She led a conga line. It was great. The second myth I wanted to bust was the idea that we're always hobnobbing with politicians and the like. Again, it's partly true. As a junior DFAT officer, we hosted a lot of visitors from Australia, so politicians coming to in my case, India, to build bilateral relations, so they would meet their counterparts overseas. And sure, you're meeting some really famous people, but my job as a diplomat and as a junior diplomat was usually to find them a cup of tea, or to make sure that the car was on time, or to write them a brief to make sure that they knew what to talk to their counterpart about. The third myth I wanted to bust was that we're all sitting around talking about grand strategy all the time. Again, partly true. Having a sense of the world and knowing and learning about foreign policy and about how the global economy works and trade, all of these issues are incredibly important, and kudos to organisations like AIIA for building that sort of worldview and building that knowledge among not just professionals like me, but and the rest of the panel, but the broader community. But working in foreign policy doesn't mean that you're all sitting there writing policy statements constantly. Largely, it's about knowing you're a cog in the wheel, and it's about knowing where your cog fits in that grand picture, and what you're doing, whether that is making sure the car's on time for the politician who's turned up to talk to his counterpart about a trade issue, knowing how the role that cog plays in that bigger picture of Australia's interests. That said, each of those cogs can be really fun to be. And there are some fascinating jobs that you can do in DFAT and many other organisations to contribute. I've probably run over time, but I guess the only other thing I would add, given all of that, is the question I often get asked is, what makes a good DFAT officer, and how do I get in? I think key skills for any foreign policy professional is a curiosity about the world and about people, because you're going to spend a lot of time talking to people and trying to understand where they see themselves and see the world, and trying to explain how that explain how the things happening in your part of the puzzle in wherever you are, or whatever, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but whatever cog you're playing, how that fits in the broader strategy. And so having that curiosity about what's going on is really important. Of course, communication skills, writing skills, analysis skills are crucial. Building relationships is really vital because none of it gets done without them. And I might leave it at that, but I'm really happy to take questions. Yeah, thanks, Nikki.
So we will move on to question time. I might stay standing up so I can move the microphone around. Are there any questions in the audience at current or online? One question in the audience.
You go first.
Yeah, and I'll just read it out after you for our viewers online.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your insight. It's very interesting. My question is, so coming back to Australia, since you're a student and working overseas in international development as well, speaking of SDGs, equal access to education. So not having a name that's so local, but then coming here trying to really step up and really trying to be like, I can do this, but the name is a bit foreign. How do you sort of break that barrier and be like, no, I can do that project, or I can organize that local NGO that does that kind of project? It's just a name that's sort of fancy.
So I'll just repeat that question. So just in relation to having a foreign sounding name and coming into the country, and how to break those kind of barriers down that might have, and any advice on doing that. Sorry.
Not as in my name, as in like working in a foreign country.
Oh, working in a foreign country and then coming back into Australia. Does anyone have anything to say? Yeah.
You go first and then maybe we can pass it down. That's a really great question. And often when I talk to young women from my organization, they have similar thoughts and concerns. They say, well, I've worked for this amazing organization in my country that's really well known and it's having so much impact, and I'm from a context that everyone really understands that, but then when I look at going to a posting overseas, no one's really understood what I've done and what I've achieved and worked so hard for. One thing that I always say to them, and it might sound a bit basic and a bit unusual, but is really to just let your passion for what you do shine through, because I think at the end of the day, people that work in development, most of us work there because we care deeply and passionately about what we do, whether we work in gender equality or climate change or poverty reduction or things like that. And I think even if people don't recognize the name of an organization where you've worked, they recognize your commitment to the topic and the cause. And I think really just taking time to set up meetings with people and have a chat and just explain, why you're so passionate about what you do and the impact that you've had. I think that's something that's probably a really good first step. And I know a lot of our young women have found that to be really successful, even though it does sound like such a basic thing to do. So I'd really encourage you to try and do that, and hopefully that will work for you also. Would anyone else like to add?
Sure. I suppose I would just add that although like a company name can matter, like it might help you to get an interview because you've worked for a prestigious company or something like that. I don't think it's really come up all that often, or previous experiences. Whenever I have interviews, they don't know of previous companies that I've worked for. But I think it's best to focus less on the name and more on, what skills are you bringing to the table? What was your position there? What were your responsibilities? What did you contribute to? And what skills can you then bring to the company that you're applying for and tailor it to them? Because, well, at least from my experience, they don't really care too much what company you work for. They don't care if they know it that much or not. They're just really interested in knowing how what you took from that and how it applies to the position that you're interested in.
Yeah, I can't add much to that. That was a very good point. I think it's even when you are in an organisation that is very well known, it can be really hard to explain what it is that you were doing in that organisation, right? And why it mattered and why that makes you, that means that you have the experience to be able to do this next thing. And so I think it's incumbent on, unfortunately, on you to explain, as Thomas said, what you did, what skills that showed, and what impact you had. And if that's the case, then it shouldn't matter where it was or what it was called.
Take a question online.
Yep, sure thing. Our first question online comes from Lindsay. She asks, sometimes I struggle with how to break into this area as a proper career. Often it's hard to network while also juggling work and studies. What would you recommend for someone who's trying to get experience while juggling studies, work, and building experience sort of outside of university, especially if you're coming from a background where you don't, quote unquote, know people?
That's a really good question. I think it's hard for me to answer that because I guess I feel very lucky that I was successful in this graduate program. But I guess on the flip side, I also didn't know people. So I came from Western Australia, and most people that I went to school, none of my family were in this sort of a career in the public service. I went through law school, but almost all of my law school friends ended up in a law firm. For me, it was just about following something that seemed more interesting than law. I think, but the challenge, I think, is not so much that knowing people means that you're going to get a hand in, because, well, at least in the public service, that's not how it works. And there's a reason there's a 5-step graduate interview process. It's more, the challenge is then more that understanding what it is that their employer is looking for. Because if you don't have people around you that you can ask, well, what does that job actually mean? Then it's really challenging to know what to write in your job application. So I'd rather than seeing networking as a tool to land you the first job, I would rather see it as an opportunity to just ask people lots of questions about what the job is like, so that you can think more about how you might reflect your experience in your application.
Yeah, I would just quickly add on to that I think you'd be surprised how receptive people are and how generous people are with their time, even very busy and successful people. And so even if you're busy, you probably have half an hour somewhere during the week to email someone and just ask them for coffee. And so much can come from that. A lot cannot come from it, but there are times when things do come from it. And I've seen time and time again, people coming up. When I was working at the Australia-China Relations Institute, people would come up all the time trying to get our director's time, and he would always sit with them and perhaps he'd tell them about a piece of work that he's writing on and say, okay, prove yourself, go and write me a paragraph on this topic or help me with this bit of research. And that's an opportunity. That's, like I said, that's not competing with, that's how you can avoid some competition as well, by taking those steps, you might meet someone that just gives you an opportunity to write something and to prove yourself, and that can turn into a job very quickly.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it really just took me back to my own younger days of trying to manage everything and not knowing where you're going to find the time to do internships and all the things you feel like you should be doing. I think, yeah, the team, other panelists have made really good points. One thing that I would echo as well, which goes back to what my co-panelists has said, is really just prioritizing what's important to you. I think when we think about, internships and making an impact, especially if you want to work in international development, it can feel quite overwhelming. But if you find something that you genuinely are passionate about, something you genuinely care about, then I think it really makes that prioritization much easier, because you'll find that you actually really enjoy the work that you're doing. That's not only, building your resume and will help you get a job and all those kinds of things, but it actually has real world impact. And so that would probably be the key thing that I would try and do, is just to find what that is for you. The second thing, sort of going to what the co-panelist said as well about networking. So I grew up in a very beautiful small town called Grafton, 8 hours north of Sydney, 20,000 people, beautiful farming community. And I worked for the UN in New York. So, anything is possible. It's, as the team said, I don't think as much about, who you know, but just demonstrating that you're really passionate and actually caring really deeply about what you do. And I think if you find that, then things just kind of naturally fall into place.
I might add one last thing as well. You mentioned that you were still at university studying. That is the beginning of a network. Your university lectures, if you go up to them, they might have the opportunity to be able to introduce you to people in the areas that you're interested in. I'm currently doing that myself. I'm doing a master's degree, and there's a specific area that I'm super interested in getting into that I don't currently work in now. And I've gone to my lecturers and said, hey, is there people at these organizations that you can introduce me to? Or is there organizations that I'm not even aware of that are working in this area? So you have a network that you can already start tapping into. And lecturers will always want to help you. They just want to see you succeed. So definitely tap into that. All right, are there any more questions in the room? Yep.
I've got a question about getting involved at DFAT. In my life, I probably want to work in both the public and the private sector. So I'm just wondering whether it's more natural to flow from the private sector into DFAT or from DFAT into the private sector, or whether it's just a complete mixed bag.
Okay, I'll just quickly repeat that question. So the question was wanting to work in both the private and the public sector, and where is it best to start first? Would it be better to start within DFAT and then go private, or vice versa?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because I've really only worked in the public sector. And actually, I think the two don't really understand each other very well. And so it goes back to the problem that the first question asked, which is about just being able to explain how that experience is actually relevant to the other one that you're looking at. I don't think there's a path that makes sense that is better than the other. I think, go to what interests you and follow opportunities, and then keep following them until you get bored and move to something else, I suppose. And when you want to make that jump, just be able to explain the skills you had, whether it was in the private sector or the public, how those are relevant to the other.
Yeah, thanks. I might also actually quickly add to this, although not related to DFAT, but working in the public state sector, the advice that I've heard, and it's a lot harder moving from public sector to private in those higher levels. You may have to take that pay cut, and especially if it, for instance, it's consulting work and you haven't gotten consulting experience, there is that kind of disconnect there. But ultimately, yeah, it very much depends on where in the private sector, what you want to be doing. Yeah, there is also that, yes. Any questions online, Alex?
Yep, we've got a few.
Great.
I'll go with this one next. Does DFAT or other organisations consider lived experience for job roles, for example, a refugee who's been through a war, or is it only for people who have access to a university education?
That is maybe I can start with that one. Yes, lived experience, most definitely, particularly at the United Nations, counts, because, you don't really understand something until you've been through it. No amount of reading a textbook or writing a policy can really make you understand what it's like to have that experience. For what you said, for an example of being a refugee. And so there is a real push at the moment within the United Nations to recognise lived experience. So there are definitely lots of roles available for people who would like to contribute to international development in that way, and really a lot of opportunities to make impact. Speaking particularly from a youth lens as well, there is so many new councils and advisor groups that have been formed recently by various UN agencies, looking at just that, about bringing more people with lived experience into advise on projects and policy and things like that. So please, never feel like if you perhaps haven't had the opportunity to go to university or to work extensively in the space, that you can't have an impact somewhere like the United Nations, because you absolutely can, and there's lots and lots of opportunities available.
To be honest, I don't know what our policy is on this question. I'm happy to sort of follow up with through AIIA and get that answer to you on our actual on our policy. But I guess there are definitely new approaches and a lot of thinking going into how to better reach out to certain communities. In particular, I know that there's a focus on ensuring that DFAT has representation from our Indigenous communities, and so there's a lot of effort going into making sure that that there is representation there, and that their experiences are valued in the recruitment processes, and that they are reflected in our organisation. But I will come back to you on the specific other points. Yeah.
If the questioners ask this, let's follow up with us kind of. Mic on, that would help. If the questioner wants to follow up with us privately, kind of we can liaise and kind of we can get through that. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a question that we can't deal with kind of in the abstract, so we might move on to our next one. We've got a very quick one for Tom, if he's willing to take it. Which Chinese language did you study, and what was your fluency level when you started working in China?
I studied Mandarin Chinese, and my fluency was 0-ish. I say ish, because I was supposed to be formally studying it for 2 or 3 years. But maybe it's just me, but I'm not sure how much you can really learn of a language at university. That's probably just a reflection on me, not you guys. But yeah, very, very low. But I think there's other ways that you can really prove yourself. And obviously when you're leaving university, even though all these job descriptions say we want 3 years experience out of university, like it's not true. It's not possible either. So there's many other ways to sort of market yourself and still get an opportunity. And then, when you do get that, then really make the most of it so that when you do come back, you can speak a little bit more of the language. But if the person asking the question is studying Chinese and they're not happy with their current level, then I'd recommend, doing formal classes. And there are so many platforms and apps out there that will help you to make friends with native speakers around the world. And you can really rapidly increase your speaking ability just using apps and platforms.
Do we have any more questions in person? Otherwise, okay, yep.
My question is just about upskilling. So I'm interested in working in sort of programs division of like particular international development organizations. I've spoken to people within the organization that I work for, and so one thing I'm looking at is the certificate of humanitarian logistics. But away from that sort of logistics area, I'm interested about what each of you have sort of observed about some upskilling courses like in your early career, maybe some that have sort of come out of left field, but that seem really relevant for like your area of interest.
So the question was upskilling courses and some that you might not think of but have been really helpful in your careers.
Great question. So there's a couple of things that are always really useful. So lots of people don't know the United Nations actually has a free training academy. It's called UNITAR, UNITAR, and they run a lot. They do run some paid courses, but their free courses are really excellent. So I would suggest checking out the website and seeing if there's anything that kind of appeals to you in the particular area of interest that sort of you feel would help and align with what you're doing. The other thing, which I suspect you may have already discovered, is courses through Redar, particularly here in Australia, are really, really useful. But the thing actually that I always encourage people to do is just get practical volunteering experience in the field. Even now, many things are digital and you can support projects in areas where it wouldn't have been possible. Of course, this is very, dependent on internet access and things like that. But certainly through my organization, for example, what we do is we provide practical experience for people to, write policy for UN submissions, start their own projects in the field. And then this helps a lot of young women transition into formal paid employment in the sector. So I think if you have the time and the financial capacity to do that, then that's a really great way to get involved and to sort of provide a practical experience of upskilling.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can upskill. Many free online courses that you can do and paid. I'll just give you a recent example. I recently did an influence and negotiating course, which my company was kind enough to pay for. And this is not relevant to my job, but taught me a lot about how to sort of just prepare proposals, and this can apply to really anything in your life. How do you prepare what you want in advance, and how do you work with others to have like some sort of value add negotiation? And it will just give you a lot of like communication skills and confidence. It may not be directly applicable to the work or job that you have, but it's a really important skill that makes you a better decision maker and worth checking out. It was a service provider. It was called Scott Work. Yeah.
I don't know if I have a lot to add, but I guess what I would say is I think there's a temptation, and I've certainly had it, to enroll in lots and lots of courses to continue to build on your training and expertise. But I think once you're in a job and you've got a year or two's experience, the qualification that you've got becomes so much less relevant. I studied law. My mum still thinks I'm a lawyer, but I'm not. And I haven't gone back to university and studied anything else to become an international relations person. I've never studied trade, but I spend my days talking to businesses about the impacts of global trade flows on their businesses. My point is, like the other panelists have said, use once you've cracked something and can get some experience of working in an office, it's the skills that matter more than what you're gonna learn in a course. And so that's why I suppose Thomas's suggestion about those sort of skills-based courses might be helpful, but yeah, don't. I feel like some university is going to come at me from behind, but don't enroll in extra courses because you think that's going to help you get your next step in your career. Think more about how you can use the skills that you've got. The exception, I think, is if you're trying to pivot your career. If you're trying to jump from the public service to the private and you want to be able to show that you understand how the private sector works, or, you're trying to, make a significant pivot, or, yeah, I think then maybe a course is helpful, but don't, in my view, I don't think adding courses is necessarily the only path forward.
So that's probably all we have time for in regards to questions. So firstly, I'd like to thank the three panelists for giving up their evening to provide advice to young professionals and students. I think there was a lot of really valuable advice there. Sorry. Please keep connected with the...
Do you want me to do this, Bill? If you're interested in keeping in touch with AIIA, you can find us on all the various social media platforms. We've got Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, very new Instagram, so please check that one out in particular. Also, our internship program will open its next round of applications on December 1st. If you're interested in getting involved with us, feel free to have a chat to Isabel and myself, or to Tom Dixon, who's up there in the blue jacket, who's our vice president. We're able to kind of talk to you about the opportunities that we've got here. I think that was my big pitch for the Institute.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And sorry, I'm not contagious. It's just a cough that won't be shaken. But yeah, I can definitely vouch for the internship program as well. If you know anyone that's interested in applying, that'll be open in December. It was such a great experience. And for those that are still looking for a stepstone and more networking experiences, it was really invaluable in that respect. I'm still friends with many of the cohort that went through with me, and obviously I'm still involved in the Institute, and it's a great community, so I would highly recommend trying to attend more of the events as well. But thank you for all coming tonight. It's been great hosting the event. Thank you.